thank you all for having us here. I think first and foremost, I'll speak for all of us and probably our excitement of being at this conference in particular. I know we may seem like a little bit of an outlier in terms of content, but I do remember from this morning's session a lot of conversation around how important it is to open up your perspective and to work across industries and think innovatively, but from different perspectives, right? We don't necessarily know how to solve challenges if we're not talking outside of our silos and our individual industries to get other input and feedback. So very excited today to start a conversation here. I know that the community within HT Next and in the vendor community has long time been engaged and interested in supporting the fight against human trafficking. And we're here today to really continue that conversation and think through some new areas of innovation I think we can uncover together and drive forward. So thank you each for being here and chatting with me this afternoon. I think we probably should start with a level set, right? We know that human trafficking, I think, has become more common in general terminology, you know, movies and TV shows, et cetera, but we know that's not always the truth. So Rose, in your work with the FBI, you can paint us a picture of kind of what human trafficking is and looks like today.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rose Vesci. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI. Prior to that, I was a field agent with the FBI. In my 18th year of doing this type of work. And most of my career was spent in crimes against children and human trafficking and sex trafficking cases. It's been very rewarding. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what is and isn't human trafficking. And I'm also going to tell you that there are different types of trafficking. Most of my trafficking cases involve minors, although I did have some sex trafficking cases of adults. So I want to start off with human trafficking myths or misconceptions. I'm going to say that again. These are myths or misconceptions. The reason I'm emphasizing that is I recently presented to a couple hundred law enforcement officers in Mexico with a translator, and I found out later she did not explain, she didn't understand, there was a miscommunication, so she didn't understand these are myths or misconceptions. Human trafficking is motivated by bias, anger, and hate, and must involve beatings and chains. All victims are minors, all victims are girls. Victims self-identify and want to be rescued. Human trafficking must involve foreigners. Human trafficking is about movement and borders. Criminal prosecution is not needed. If they get paid, they are not victims. Human trafficking only occurs in underground illegal industries, and trafficking is another word for smuggling. So again, these are common misconceptions and myths about trafficking. The biggest surprise for me when I started this work in 2010 and they told me I was going to investigate sex trafficking of minors is I had in my head some Hollywood version of human trafficking, like the movie Taken, and I thought child sex trafficking victims were kids on cargo ships from like the Philippines or some other country. It was a huge eye-opener to me to learn that my misconceptions were wrong, and that many of the kids that we recover are actually U.S. kids in the foster care system, U.S. kids in group homes, and things like that. So now I've kind of explained what are myths about human trafficking. I'm going to briefly define what human trafficking is. It's when a person is bought, sold, and exploited through force, fraud, or physical or psychological coercion. It includes sex and labor trafficking, and there's also something called domestic servitude, which is when a domestic worker is not free to leave his or her employment and is abused or underpaid or not paid at all. So those are the type of trafficking that the FBI investigates. Victims can be adults, juveniles, U.S. citizens, or foreign-born individuals. They're often beaten, starved, and forced to work as sex workers or take grueling jobs as domestic, restaurant, factory, or agriculture workers with long hours, far exceeding the average work with little or no pay. It's not just a foreign problem, it's also a domestic problem. This is an interesting statistic. The largest percentage and greatest number of sex trafficking victims recovered in the United States are U.S. citizens. However, foreign workers are victimized as well, and the largest percentage of labor trafficking victims recovered in the United States are foreign-born. So a lot of the information I'm quoting you on comes from two reports, and they're really interesting if you want to look them up later. One is the State Department's TIP report, TIP, Trafficking in Persons. It has a lot of useful information about U.S. and foreign government trafficking statistics. The other one is called the Human Trafficking Institute report. and it's based on federal and state court data. So that one has a lot of information I think you would find relevant about hotel industries and cases in hotels. Again, that's the Human Trafficking Institute's 2020 report. That's the version I'm quoting from today. All 56 of the FBI's field offices have reported human trafficking incidents. Some industries vulnerable to sex trafficking are hospitality, entertainment, hotels, motels, cruise ships, casinos, nightclubs, exotic dance clubs, commercial sex industry, modeling agencies, major sporting events, business conventions, and similar in labor trafficking to some of them I've mentioned, in addition to agriculture industry, meat packing facilities, slaughterhouses, farm workers, landscaping, construction, custodial work, supply chain factories, restaurants. So the 2020, this is another information point I think you'll find interesting. The 2020 Federal Human Trafficking Report is an annual publication that provides comprehensive data from every federal criminal and civil human trafficking case in the United States that the court handles. And there's a lot of information about different hotels, which hotels have been involved in cases. At the end, if we have time, I'll give a case example.
Yeah, because I think what you're trying to say in all of this really is the takeaway is it doesn't just look like one thing or one way. That when we say human trafficking, it can have lots of different characteristics and elements and dynamics to those cases. And I think that can make it really challenging when we're training on this topic, when we're building awareness on it as well. And what we do know is that traffickers exploit our industry, the hospitality industry. And in the last couple of years, so much has changed in our business model, but a lot has also changed in the business model of those who perpetrate these types of crimes. And I think that's where we'd like to get a little bit of insight, Brittany. In the work that Safe House Project does to support survivors and build national capacity for that, what are some of the things you've seen changed when we talk about these standard definitions? What's evolved in the past 2 years that makes it look a little bit different?
Yeah, so my name is Brittany Dunn, as you said, and we run an organization called Safe House Project, and we have the privilege and opportunity to walk alongside survivors of trafficking in their healing journey. And so part of that is really allows us to maybe see behind the curtain of what and who is perpetrating this crime against so many individuals within our communities. So when we launched our organization, it was in response to the fact that hundreds of thousands of American kids are trafficked every year in the United States, but that victim identification is only at 1%. And so when we're only capturing 1% of the data, it's really hard to truly understand what this looks like, and that leaves room for these myths and misperceptions to kind of take the front stage as kind of fact.
Right.
But when we continue to walk alongside survivors, what we find is that over 40% of minor victims in the United States are first trafficked by a family member. So that's really important for us to understand, because that's going to then look very different when it comes to them entering into our hotels or into our schools or into different parts of our community. The other important thing to understand is that a trafficker does not look one way. One of our very first cases was a 10-year-old girl who was being trafficked, and the person perpetrating these crimes wasn't some man that was much older. It was her grandmother. And so we really have to open our eyes to the fact that traffickers look like people just in our community who are exploiting vulnerable individuals. And so I think that's really been important for us. We've also then seen other emerging trends during COVID as well, where there has been an uptick in the individuals who are being sold to meet basic needs.
Yeah.
And so we really have to understand how external forces have such a really hard impact on the issue of trafficking within our communities.
Right, we call those kind of push-pull factors, right? We know that trafficking involves oftentimes layers of vulnerability that are exploited. And so the more vulnerability individuals have, whether it's unemployment or poverty or other components of prior sexual abuse, right? That just adds to that opportunity that they have to be exploited. So Alia, as a survivor leader and having both personal and professional experience in this space, how have you And Safe House Project and your law enforcement partners had to adapt and innovate in these recent years.
Yeah, especially since COVID, right?
Right.
So I think that we've watched a lot of things change. One, from a funding side, things definitely changed during COVID. A lot of the services that we were originally able to point survivors towards either went virtual or disappeared due to lack of funding or just a lack of a way of going virtual. And so we were seeing a lot of survivors with increased needs and a lack of services. So a lack of availability to meet those needs. And law enforcement was watching a lot more survivors come with severe mental health needs, and so that was taking a different strategy for them, as well as just things looked different during COVID in the same way that they looked different for all of us, and how we would go about our work. They looked differently for traffickers and those being trafficked. And traffickers found new ways to recruit victims. They found new ways to exploit victims. We saw a lot of actual trafficking happening only online, to where there was never a third, an actual buyer trafficked person face to face. And so those were really challenging things for law enforcement to start to learn how to adapt to. But I think we've gotten to a point now where we've really learned to do that, as well as we saw just an increase in the number of people that were looking to exit. And in the last year or so, I've seen that increase, at least through our channels, that has increased. And so when you have an increase in people looking for services, but a lack of funding resources, because purse strings got tightened, of course, during COVID, it made for a very difficult dynamic, but one that I see the industry as a whole continuing to find solutions to and working to fill those gaps.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm actually really excited to have come on board and into this industry right at a tipping point where I think particularly our hotel members have really recognized that gap between needs and services that are available. And we now have a $1.5 million survivor fund that has been launched with a number of our members who have really committed to supporting community-based organizations that are doing this work and helping fill that gap. And we're looking forward to awarding those in 23. So now that we've kind of brought the audience along in terms of what human trafficking looks like and how we see it, Zoila, I'm going to turn to you as a representative of Encore. I think it makes sense to everybody here in the room why we might have the FBI and Safe House Project on this panel. And in this case, you're a little bit of an anomaly. What is bringing Encore to this conversation?
Sure, absolutely. So as the largest event technology company in our space, we represent over 11,000 team members globally. And so these are 11,000 ears and eyes that are across a variety of locations, venues, conventions, and countries, really. And so we really recognize the power in our numbers. And so our company is committed to providing training on human trafficking so that our team members are well versed on how to recognize signs of human trafficking. And year to date, I'm proud to say that 7,000 of our team members have already taken the training. It's offered in 5 languages, and we're committed to making this training on an annual basis.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I think you're absolutely a model in the vendor community, but hospitality broadly, and making that a mandate for your employees. And we're so excited at the foundation. We support a particular training program through ECPAT USA, which is a nonprofit organization also in this space who couldn't join us today. And we know that program has been taken by over 800,000 employees in this industry. And it's free, and it's 30 minutes as the introductory module, and then there's more to go from there. But it's a time commitment, and it's also investing in sort of a culture of safety as an organization, right? Because we have no shortage of things we need to train our team members on. So choosing to spend even 30 minutes on this topic really is a demonstrable effort. So thank you for that. But we also know that whenever we mandate or create or design trainings, how many people we reach is not the true impact. We are looking for real-world impact. Lives that have changed as a result of what employees have learned in these programs. And I think Encore has a great story. One of the most liked posts of AHLA in 2022 is a story that comes from one of your team members.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad to be able to tell this story today with you all on this platform, just because it really is a fantastic story. So our VP of Strategic Accounts, his name is Brad Shoemaker. He was boarding a plane at 11 p.m. It was a red-eyed flight. And he noticed a young passenger. She was anxious, she was very scared. And so it's in his good nature, he was trying to help her find her seat, but she really didn't want to engage. She was just very scared, terrified. And Brad, having taken the training just recently, he was able to quickly recognize and spot that potentially this could be suspected human trafficking. And so he took his seat and he thought, quickly he needed to get into motion. And he alerted one of the flight crew about his suspicions. And so they heard him out, and one of the flight attendants concurred with him and said, hey, you know what, I actually noticed the same signs, and I was thinking along the same lines as well. And so they delayed the plane for about 30 minutes.
Wow.
And they brought in a team, and next thing you know, that team from United Airlines, they began their processes and they removed the passenger from the airline, and then they closed the cabin. 30 minutes, they were airborne, and so Brad was summoned to the front, to the cockpit, and they told him, hey, you know what, it was confirmed, the passenger broke down, and she was being trafficked. And so this is just, and I get goosebumps as I'm saying that.
Same.
Definitely, he changed her life forever.
Right.
I mean, he absolutely changed her fate, knowing that, recognizing those signs, right? And
Right.
taking quick action as well. And so it's a testament about how bringing awareness to this subject can really change lives.
Yeah, and it really has that sort of exponential impact factor, right? Because we talk about employee training. We're thinking of them sort of utilizing this knowledge in only their professional role, but the fact is it equips them as community members when they're on a flight or in their neighborhood to have this information. And I think that is really, again, real world impact from just a training, right? Well, it seems easy then. Take the training, know what to do, report it, and lives are changed. But we all know that's a bit of an oversimplification. I think what would be really helpful, again, for everyone in this room who may or may not have programs like Encore that they participate in, is AHLA just to share some of those core indicators, but also really focusing on what things may be different now, because we have a different, like you said, post-pandemic, return to leisure travel environment that we're in.
Yeah. So I think for one, the reason why this group specifically has the ability to create such an impact through being trained is, yes, being in the community. We always hope that these kinds of trainings stay with you post, outside of work. We use the terms in our trainings where you live, work, and play.
Right.
So we are always hoping to really just indoctrinate you with this knowledge and send you out so that you see this everywhere like we do now, unfortunately. But the reality is that hotels and hotel-related industries is one of the it may be the industry outside of law enforcement and those kinds of service provisions with the greatest crossover. So many, obviously, as I'm sure you can imagine, people are trafficked in and out of hotels, whether it be from people who are looking to buy a person being in a hotel and having that person brought to them, or from many traffickers that we've experienced having girls either living in hotels or conducting their business out of hotels, and so the visibility there is you are the people that are on the ground. You are the people who are there setting up whatever it is that you're doing. You're there with security, with technology, and the different solutions. And so that allows for just an insane amount of impact in places that we're not ever going to be able to go. We're only ever going to be in one hotel at one time, whereas you have the ability to just make that impact, and that's something that's so important. So some of those signs that we have noticed and we have gathered either from survivors that we've worked with, mostly has been multiple girls in one room or one hotel room with one male as well. And so of course you're going to look at that and say that can't be the only indicator. And so that's important in this as well, is to understand that one of these things does not equal human trafficking. Right. That means that could look like a girl's trip with one person's husband tagging along. That would not hopefully ring all of the bells to bust down the doors. But some of these things in conjunction with others, where Another one that we see often is when there is a girl in one room and there's also an adjoining room. I've seen a lot of cases in which the trafficker stays in the adjoining room while the girl conducts her business in the other room. With multiple non-guest males coming in and out of that room. And so you can see areas where that might be something that a solution could be created to identify. Are these people guests that are coming in and out of this one specific room? Are they not? Is there a person coming down to, in those hotels where there are those key cards that you can only go to your floor if you have a key card? In those situations, the survivors that we've worked with have had to go down and actually meet the person that we're buying and come back up and with that person, and that has happened multiple times a day for every survivor. And so those are some of the key indicators as well.
Yeah, that's helpful because I think the intention behind this conversation, today and ongoing is we know a lot about what human trafficking looks like and is in reality. You all know a lot about hotels, and you know a lot about hotel technology, right? Data and things that are being looked at and collected for a variety of different purposes. And where are these things crossing over that we might not even realize, right?
And I think that's why it's so important to do, you are never going to be able to there's so many different types of training or trafficking, so many different types of people who are being victimized, so many different business models of trafficking, that something like this is never going to be comprehensive to cover all of those signs and indicators for each type of trafficking in each situation. And that's why a training like yours is so important.
Yeah, thank you. No, I definitely encourage people to take a look through our website. I also think we'd be remiss if we don't put on the screen now a couple of key phone numbers, and I do phone kind of old school numbers, but there's also text and chat options for all of these, if you have a chance to put that on the screen. But these are reporting hotlines that are available to members of the public to call in and make reports of what they're seeing or what they've experienced themselves. And I think the key there, and again, I'm going to speak on behalf of all of us who work in this space, we'd rather people call with a, I'm not entirely sure, and give whatever information they have access to that they feel comfortable with, than I'm not sure, so I'm not going to call, right? So err on that side of information, because a lot of these hotlines and these reporting numbers basically collate data and information. So it may be you and 3 other people in that hotel that talk about room number 152, right? And so it's the combination of those 3 reports that could lead to further action. And it's important that we make sure that's available to law enforcement at any time. So let's pivot and really concretely talk to this tech and vendor community, because I think that's the best use of everyone's time here today. And we know and we've heard so much about automation and the guest experience and how are the ways that we can streamline our guest stay in our properties, as well as everything from revenue management to sustainability, right? It creates efficiencies. But I think we know that there are privacy concerns on the flip side of that. Certainly we've seen a shift in our industry in that space as well. I think if you were to speak even 5 years ago, that do not disturb sign on a hotel room, we really left alone. And now including some of these major active shooter scenarios, right, where housekeeping has found things in rooms and reported it proactively. But anytime we're talking about proactive safety interventions, balancing it with privacy is just complex, right? And I think, Rose, that's something, obviously, federal law enforcement is really familiar with those challenges. But as we've seen that line get a little bit better, I would say, just better meaning easier to detect and report, what do you think has changed? What other opportunities are there for collaboration with law enforcement?
Sure. So with more education and awareness on human trafficking and other crimes, we've seen an increase in tripwires and liaison established with hotels and other industry partners. By tripwires, I mean I go out and provide a presentation on, hey, these are some things that might be indicators of human trafficking or active shooter, things like that. And then those things are, people remember those and then they call the FBI and they report a tip. So that's one thing that we've seen an increase of. There's also been an increase in cases of civil suits against hotels who were complicit or knew about the trafficking. So that's prompted more proactive efforts to receive training and collaborate with law enforcement. And useful information that we sometimes get from hotels are hotel records and different different records, because a lot of times victims are reluctant to disclose abuse, and there's a lack of police reports. So I can have a victim tell me everything that happened, and then the case is headed towards a trial, and they're done cooperating, right? So if I have hotel records and information like that that can corroborate this victim's statement, it's super helpful. Camera systems in hotels are very useful as well, and we've seen an increase in those helping us with whether it be a missing kid or a trafficking victim. There's an app called Trafficking Cam. Has anyone or everyone heard of Traffic Cam? You can put it on your phone, and anyone in the public can take a photo of their hotel room, upload it to this app, and through technology, if we're looking for a missing kid or a trafficking victim and there's an ad for them, this app will compare the hotels that people have put into the app with an active ad for someone that we're looking for. So,
right, it's an open source platform in that way, right? It's publicly
right.
sourced. I know at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we had a tremendous partnership with Traffic Cam, and all of our online child sexual exploitation cases would match with those images. Yeah, tremendous.
And you can just take a picture of your room. No one has to be in it. Just a picture of your hotel room is great. One last thing I wanted to add is, again, the Human Trafficking Institute's 2020 report. When honing in on the specific venues where sex trafficking took place, hotels were the most common. In 77% of active sex trafficking cases involving a completed sex act, a sex act occurred at a hotel. The major hotel chains implicated most frequently in active sex trafficking cases were the same as in years past. 5 hotel brands were the location of more than a third of these cases, and in 2020, civil plaintiffs sued 149 defendants for sex trafficking, nearly half of which were hotels. Although this represented a 42% decline in civil sex trafficking defendants compared to 2019, it was still well above the average when looking at the preceding 5 years. This relatively high number of new sex trafficking defendants in the civil context comes on the heels of a series of trafficking lawsuits against big names hotels filed in 2019. Again, this information comes from the Human Trafficking Institute's 2020 report. Very, very good information.
Yeah, we certainly, I think, have seen so much more attention paid in the last 5 years, an increase in reporting and identification, also that reveals some deeper gaps in services. But I think, again, as we move into this time of automation and increased automation and think about where we should automate further in our industry, that's just, we know, a tremendous mountain of data, right? What are some of the, from a survivor perspective, those of you that work directly with survivors, what kind of data are we talking about that would be interesting to give us some insights from our industry?
I think one thing, and this was something that you and I were talking about before, Eliza, it would be really interesting to see how many times when somebody is being trafficked in a hotel room, how many times that room was rented in the trafficker's name versus the person being exploited when it's an adult being exploited. That would be really interesting to see. It would be really interesting to track the amount of people coming in and out of that room, whether that room itself was the room being used to traffic the person, or whether they were going out. Those would be things that would be really interesting to see data behind as well, and if that changed based off demographic and location and area in the country or type of hotel. If those data points changed, that would be really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think, and a speaker earlier today was talking about how automation just helps us look for patterns and anomalies. And that's exactly what's insightful when we're talking about this type of illegal behavior. In the same way that it was for fraud, right? When we looked at fraudulent transactions, patterns and anomalies. And I think translating it into this space is really critical, and I think is part of why we engage with this community to do that with us. From the vendor perspective, Zoila, in addition to this data component and technology component, what are some of the ways you think that the vendor community can continue to engage and really build our team in the fight against human trafficking?
Sure, and I think Alia actually alluded to it earlier as far as our presence in the industry. So because of the nature of our work, we play a big part, or we have a large hand in large special events such as the Olympics, the World Cup, the conventions and concerts, and you name it. And so, something that I learned recently, obviously knowing that these events do increase business for local suppliers and everybody that has a hand in it, it also increases the demand for human trafficking, all these special events. And so as vendors and suppliers, we are actually in spaces and at different times, and maybe in the back of house of hotels, where we can actually presence that kind of behavior, right, and pick up on it, where others wouldn't, maybe other staff members of the hotel wouldn't. So it's important to keep our eyes and ears open during those setup times or those late night hours or so on. And I actually have a quick story that just recently happened as well, where one of my director of sales, they were at a concert. It was a late night concert. He was walking the hallways to make sure the room was refreshed for the next day, and he ran into a bickering couple, and the female broke down crying, ran into the bathroom, and then the male followed her, and he immediately saw that and said, "Hey sir, should I call security?" And you know, he's like, no, and then he left, and then he still let security know just in case. But you know, I think that's how we can have impact.
Right, and that could have been a victim of domestic violence. It could have been any number of things that were happening in that scenario, not just, you know, potentially trafficking, but it's being that extra eyes and ears, and from a different perspective than, say, our front desk personnel may have in these scenarios. So I'll say it again, it begs these really ongoing conversations between those of us who support survivors and who conduct investigations with those who create and implement and deliver technologies in this space. But I certainly think we're trying to marry those data opportunities with operational realities, honestly, for all of us. And I'm wondering, Brittany, what's the role of survivors in these conversations, right?
Yeah, I think what's really important, so my background is actually in mergers and acquisitions for technology companies, and so having that lens into watching products be developed from the beginning to the end. And so much of what we would do as a tech firm was to make sure that we had our end users in mind, which I'm sure is very familiar to everybody in this room. And so much of that is when we think about how do we want to solve or contribute to the solution around trafficking within the vendor community is engaging survivors up front, having them part of those working sessions and those early on discussions, because if you can identify where they were intersecting hoteliers or staff or vendors while they were on premise or maybe in the vicinity, then you have an opportunity to start from that point and develop your solution with those data inputs as part of that larger solution. I think the other neat piece of that is as the vendor community really knits together these different data points, it builds the picture in a way, to Rose's point, that is much more compelling for a prosecutor to really move forward with. And so when I look at so many of the different groups in the room and walk, you know, the vendor hall, I see that, you know, there's an opportunity on the security buttons to maybe have that button that just you click if you feel like there was an instance at some point in the hotel where they had a suspicion that something might be happening. Because that's going to geolocate to that part of the hotel, well, maybe then you'll know which room it was, you know, in proximity to. Well, if that also happened when somebody checked in and they're checking a box saying, oh, there was something suspicious at check-in, or they paid cash, or there was a weird interaction between the individuals coming in, all of those data points coming together just helps us to broaden the aperture of really what we're reviewing and create those patterns as we've really tried to highlight here today. And so I think the thing that I would really hope is as we move forward together in identifying opportunities for growth and solutions, we're looking at it not just within our own sphere, but also in those that we have complementary services to. And then using survivors' lived experience to inform what are the data points that we're driving toward.
Right, agreed. And admittedly, there's probably people in this room going, we couldn't really do that. Like, I know you might want that information, but there's no way we could have it. And that's an equally productive conversation for those of us in this space. Okay, so if that's not possible, what may be or what could be possible? And I think that's where that two-way conversation should be. You know, Alia, what advice would you give to those of us who are trying to bring these conversations together between survivors and professionals in the tech space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Oh gosh, for one, to make sure that it is a space that is ready for that. I think the work of bringing in a survivor happens before the survivor is actually brought in. So having conversations with other organizations that have utilized survivor consultants is probably the first step to see what would they do differently, what did they do well, and creating places of safety, right? That's something that we're already talking about. That space needs to be a place of safety as well. So lots of conversations with the survivor prior to bringing them in about what kind of environment they need. Is this going to be completely virtual? Are there going to be one-on-one meetings that need to happen? If so, maybe not having that one-on-one meeting be with a man, just to put that out there. So just certain levels of safeties and lots of levels of transparency with the survivor. What is the expectation exactly? What is the work product that's expected? What is the financial compensation? Because financial compensation needs to be a part of this. We are working individuals with jobs and children's and lives and rent to pay as well, in the same way that you are, and this is our expertise for most of us. There are a host of other things that we could get deeper into, and our contact information is up there. And if that's something that, as an organization, you're looking to do, to hire a survivor to figure out what are the areas of input that your specific tech organization or your specific expertise can find themselves, we can definitely try and help figure out how to do that in the most survivor-informed and trauma-informed way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that's the value of partnership. I mean, there are a number of organizations that have really invested in best practices of how to involve survivors and have these conversations be survivor-driven and survivor-led. And I think the partnerships and the ways that the foundation and AHLA can be supportive of that is through those partnerships. Or what are the organizations that are doing this well, and how do we create these conversations and safe spaces for that? So we've talked a lot today in the conference about what we call sort of the net zero effect. And I think the real conversation needs to be more in this space of net positive, right? Not just where we're kind of giving back, or at least making sure we're not having a deficit in our contributions, but what are we giving back to communities? And interestingly, Brittany, you talked to me earlier about the perspective of guests and clients who are choosing products and hotels in this, environment. And what do we know about what they're looking for from the companies that they're going to select?
Yeah, I don't think it's too different than, honestly, the ESG conversation earlier today, that 78% of consumers will make a decision based on the values of the company. And with so many of the next generation, millennials, Gen Z, using that as kind of their determining factor for where they're going to stay, where they're going to engage, it really opens the door for an opportunity for people to get involved and do good within the community while still driving revenue back to the bottom line. And I think that's really important to note, that this isn't, yes, we have the heart of the survivors and we want to see people identified, and of course that is the greatest motivator in this work for us. But we also understand that you all are business owners and you are working to contribute in a variety of ways, whether it's environmental solutions or to your employees and helping them come out of the past few years of a very volatile market. And so we understand that there's a lot of competition for your attention, for your time, and for the solutions that you're working toward. And so I think it really comes back to, okay, how can we work together? How can we use platforms like AHLA and the foundation to facilitate these conversations, to draw out themes and trends and opportunities, and then just constantly going back to that idea of building integrity into our products. And when we do that and we build integrity in, I think we end up at something a lot better than a net zero.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that the idea is, combating human trafficking, both explicitly and visibly, whether it's denoting it on your website or in reviews and sort of having some type of certification. There's also what happens behind the scenes through these data systems and otherwise that can really demonstrate a commitment to this and ultimately bolster the image of your brand and your properties as one of the safe places, right? And companies that are corporate responsibility is at the core of their values. So thank you. Well, I want to make sure we leave room for questions. So I'll start with one preliminary closing question. Then we'll open it up and maybe close out after that. one thing you want everyone in this room to remember from our conversation today, something that if they really just tuned out because it's post-lunch and late afternoon, they'll listen now to the one thing that you would like to either change their mind about or perspective on human trafficking. You want to start, Brittany?
Sure. I guess for me, it just goes back to if you're going to enter into the space of trafficking, to start those conversations from the beginning and to really build that and survivor-informed, trauma-informed solution that provides an opportunity for for somebody to exit that situation and receive holistic care, healing. And that is where, we are happy to partner. Like our survivor hotline is the entire purpose of that is that we receive tens and hundreds of per year survivors exiting their situation and getting into safe housing and being able to be set on a different path. And when you can see that come full circle, it's just a beautiful image of really where we can help people get in their own healing journey and build healthier communities.
Thank you.
I think for me, it would be just the request that the phrase, like, no, that person couldn't be trafficked would just be exited from anyone's mind.
Right.
Like we've worked with survivors in wheelchairs, we've worked with survivors with the severe medical disabilities, with severe mental health disabilities, with severe intellectual disabilities, from all different demographics of society. And so I think that would be the number one. The other one would probably be the definition that Rose gave about what actually trafficking is, being that it is specifically for us for sex trafficking, which is what we work with primarily, the commercial sex acts through force, fraud, or psychological coercion, or, and this is the one that I always, I believe, shocks people, when the person is under the age of 18.
Right. Like no matter
so if
what.
the person is under
what.
the age of 18 and there is a commercial sex act that happens, or the intent to have that commercial sex act happen, that is trafficking, whether there's a third-party exploiter or not, and force, fraud, and coercion does not need to be present if it's a minor.
Thank you. Eliza.
I would say there's no one face for human trafficking, right? So let's not dismiss the power in our numbers as an industry in creating the awareness and having real impact in the world. So, it's real stuff. It's happening every day, and sometimes it happens right underneath our eyes. So the more we know about it, the more awareness we create, the more impact we can have on this subject.
Thank you.
I would say if you see something, say something. Sounds simple but true. The FBI can't combat human trafficking alone. We rely really heavily on our partnerships, industry, NGOs. And also, we can't end human trafficking one person, one survivor at a time. With your help, we can target the systems that make human trafficking possible.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really true. And I think, again, you all in this room may not know what trafficking looks like in all those different versions. We do, just like you all know the technologies and the possibilities there that we're not aware of. And I really look forward to those continued conversations and how we can start to get really tactical about what opportunities there may be for better reporting, identification, detection, and intervention. Happy to open up to questions at this point if there's anything from the audience. I see one really enthusiastic hand over here. Mike, is there no mic? Coming.
Thank you. So appreciate that people don't always get on aircraft to move about, but it's always been a surprise to me, maybe the FBI representative could answer this, it's always been a surprise to me that I could move with my children through airports from state to state within a single country. They want to see my ID. They want to check I am who I am. They are not interested in seeing any identification of my children who are minors. So how the heck do they know that those children are mine? So wouldn't it make sense for us just to adopt the same process that you would go through in Europe if you are moving across state lines? Everybody needs a passport or some form of identification.
I feel like you bring up a really good point, and one that, yes, absolutely. I think there are opportunities to expand how we are making sure that children aren't being moved through airports or different venues. But I would also say that 70% of survivors we find that they don't necessarily leave the community in which they originally lived, because you don't actually have to move somebody for them to be considered trafficking. So although that, yes, that would help in any of those cases by which the airports or anything is being used, it still doesn't alleviate the responsibility to make sure that we are recognizing that it could be a child who is living, or an individual, not even just a child, an individual that's living, 10 minutes from your hotel that may still be being trafficked right there because it does not require movement.
Right.
Can I add
But
to
I
that?
think that's, the statement of why can't we just do what they do in Europe with identification, right? But yes.
Can I add to that,
Constant
Eliza?
question, please do.
Okay, and then with additionally, if we're thinking that 40 to 60% of youth that are being trafficked are being done, it's
By a family
happening by
member.
their family member. But where I do see something like that coming, like could potentially be an asset is within hotels, right? Like, what is the process to show that when I'm checking in with my 13-year-old daughter that she really is my 13-year-old daughter, or or vice versa in any sort of a situation? Like, what is that type of a process there to ensure that?
Right. That's a challenge. That's a real challenge. Other questions? Thank you.
All right, I got a question for you.
Let's see, it's hard to see too.
I appreciate your comment on see it, speak up. That's great. There's a lot of smart technology people in the hospitality world. So how do we use technology here to provide you information? Because seeing and speaking is one thing, that's manual. What kind of technology and data can we provide to help as an industry?
Thank you for that. I'm going to preface quickly by saying we have a lot of ideas. There was almost too many for this panel to talk through that, because I think essentially, certainly, we've always relied on the human factor, not only giving the information to our employees, but then our employees speaking up. And I think data offers an opportunity for further corroboration, but also alleviating that responsibility to see something and say something, right? But it's also about data in combination, not just one piece of data. So I don't know if you guys have any ideas that you feel like throwing out now, but certainly.
Well, I think that's where those kinds of consultations and working with the industry and the people who know, like, just in the way that you know your technology as well, we know the industry, and like we know the data points that are needed. Rose knows the things that she often looks for cooperation for when prosecuting a case, and so working inter-agency and understanding, like, okay, these are the things that I'm always looking for from a prosecutorial side to validate, and you saying, well, these are the ways that we can validate that through our technology, and this is how we can record those. We won't know until we have those conversations really what those can be. We do have a lot of ideas, though.
We do. We talked about, I'll give you just one quick example, because I think we're probably dying for a little bit of more meat on the bone about that. Wouldn't it be cool if, it's the conversation we play a lot, wouldn't it be cool if we could have some indication on the door locks when there is a different pattern to a door opening and closing of different hours and different intervals than we normally see, combined with some video footage that may be also an anomaly, like a back door that's propped open in the vicinity of that same room that has those strange intervals of door lock openings, right? And then it's that combination of that with a check-in pattern of an individual who is checking in alone on certain days and certain hours of the day, and together we just ask more questions or go visit that room.
Right. And so it could be that a combination of those things, even things as simple as the thermostat in the room being changed every hour or half hour, like that can signal a different buyer in the room who has different preferences for the room temperature. When you start to overlay all of those data points, then you could start to see, to your point, those anomalies, and then work that into some sort of protocol or procedure that would trigger to housekeeping to do a room check, or maybe bring up towels or whatever it is to get a little bit more clarity. But there's a lot of different ways I think we can continue to move forward.
Rose,
I would just add to that, the financial industry has for years been reporting suspicious activity relating to different things such as human trafficking, webcam, online exploitation of children with webcams is a huge thing coming from certain countries. So a lot of the financial sectors, and we can talk afterwards, are proactively providing this data that we need and saying, hey, this looks really suspicious. We think this person is producing child CSAM or child sexual abuse material, or we think this credit card is indicative of human trafficking patterns. So.
Right. I think we have a lot of lessons learned there, right, from the financial industry that we could probably translate to and move that needle from the importance of those proactive data analysis attempts to get information rather than just sort of relying on employees to make a report. So I know that we're close on time.
I think
but
we might have time
you
for one more.
Okay, great.
Oh, great. Hi. It's really more of a statement, I think, but it goes without saying that the training is super important for all of the people that are involved in the service industry. But I would also say that, people who are vulnerable, either by their age or their limited capacities in any variety of ways, deserve a training as well. Because I know for me, I had to show my nephew, he was convinced that, bad people look scary. Well, they don't.
Right.
I took him to the FDLE, site where it showed normal people, and he didn't understand it. I had to tell him, these are people that have done bad things to children. And so it's more, it's a training all the way around. And I love that you're here and that we're really focusing on this as a really critical point. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I certainly think that many of us who have been in this space, almost all of our organizations combine both the professional training with community outreach and prevention education programs, because it is that full picture, right? And certainly equipping our children, our caretakers, our communities with that information is equally as important as training professionals in this space.
Yeah, and I would add to that, our community training is available at iamonwatch.org,
Yes.
but it has a lot of ways to have those conversations with your kids. Because I also been going to these rooms, and as a parent, I know I would also be sitting there going, to your point, how do I keep my child safe?
Right.
And so we address a lot of those different things, age-appropriate conversations for kids, all of those things. Because if we build healthier communities from the ground up, then we don't have to repair broken people.
Yeah. Thank you all for your time and your expertise today, and thank you all for the time of the stage today. Thank you.